Vanessa Beeley, I truly don't know if I have to introduce you to my audience because you're a very well-known investigative journalist and you're based nowadays in Damascus and you're trying to cover the situation in Syria and recently, especially the humanitarian crisis that hit Syria strongly, especially after 2017, 2018. I just want to give a little bit background. The regime change war started in 2011 and the tools or the means for the regime change were mostly hard tools, right? The military means through financing and supporting different jihadi groups in Syria. The CIA supported the so-called Free Syrian Army, but indirectly also Jabhat al-Nusra, Ahrar al-Sham, and also other radical groups in Syria. When Trump came to power, he stopped the regime change war, the timber sycamore, and he redirected the financing of this I would say, program into the separatists in the east, the so-called SDF, who are working under the protection of the American forces, and they occupy 1/3 of the country in the east, especially 50% of the oil fields and the wheat, etc. Now we are in a position where the United States and also the European Union, they impose harsh sanctions on Syria. And there is a UN report, or the special UN rapporteur on the enjoyment of human rights in Syria, Dr. Alena Duhan. She posted her initial report after her visit to Syria. And these sanctions, if I want to summarize it in just few words, is slowly killing the Syrian people. We understand that. Can you first a little bit summarize how dire is the humanitarian situation in Syria in terms of health, education, fuel, etc.?
Yeah, and then this, as Keyboard, you know, I've been coming to Syria since 2016, been at many of the front lines, like, for example, Aleppo, Ghouta, even Dara in 2018. I've traveled through most of Syria through that time. And despite the times that mortars were literally raining down on Aleppo and on Damascus, more tens, I mean, literally thousands of people killed and injured and maimed during the years that they were under attack by the Western-backed terrorists, I never, ever saw the level of hopelessness and despair that I'm seeing now. And it's kind of, you're absolutely right. Since Trump brought in the Caesar law, which effectively also then punishes countries that come to the aid of Syria. So this is in total violation of the sovereignty of nation states. Right, because what it's saying is that nation, whether it's Russia or Iran or Iraq or Jordan, it doesn't matter. That nation does not have the right to come to the assistance of Syria or even just to economically build a relationship with Syria post-war. They will be punished for it. They will come under sanctions. So what is that? That's having a knock-on effect on everything. Because that means even imports that are coming into, for example, the port of Latakia, Syria is paying maybe double, 3 times the taxes of any other country for an external provider to run the risk of sanctions to supply Syria. And of course, on top of that, you have, for example, Israel, the Zionist entity, bombing Latakia port and bombing supply chain areas inside Syria. That's another issue that we can come on to. But for me, one thing you can't do is to divorce the terrorist war, and I include in that, of course, the state of Israel against Syria, and the sanctions. They run in parallel to punish the Syrian people effectively, right? Now, what we're seeing is a culmination of 11 years of terrorist destruction, so proxy destruction of civilian infrastructure, hijacking Syrian resources, including food sources, the wheat and barley areas, for example, the cotton plantations, the olive groves, everything. What people don't understand is from the beginning, the terrorists were instructed by the US cartel to effectively destroy civilian infrastructure, to take control of power supply hydrocarbon resources, oil resources, water. Remember in Aleppo, the deprivation by ISIS of water supply to their civilians, the destruction of the water pipes themselves. Even the US in 2016 or 17 bombed Aleppo power station directly. Under Trump, he used thermal balloons to burn the agricultural crops in the northeast. Samantha Power, now heading up USA, tried to supply genetically modified seed into the northeast, into Hasaka, which would have decimated the agricultural land for decades. Okay, so this is a multi-spectrum war. And what we're seeing now is a culmination of 11 years of that war and an increase of the economic pressure, kind of post-military victory against the Western cartel and their terrorist forces. And we're seeing, I mean, if I went into Damascus yesterday at around 11 in the morning, which would be a crazy time to try and go to Damascus from where I am, from the west of Damascus, right, in the suburbs. The roads were empty, Kevork. I've never seen them like this. There were like 3 other cars on the main drag into Damascus. That's unheard of, right? It's Christmas. It's the week before Christmas. Hospitals are literally unable to carry out a lot of fairly standard operations, medical operations, because they don't have the fuel. And whereas the government was trying to supply fuel to give them 10 or 11 hours per day to continue working, now even this has been cut back and there's no fuel for the generators. They're unable to repair equipment. As Alina Durhan said, you know, in the Basel hospital, which is on the road to Homs, virtually everything has come to a standstill, including kidney dialysis. At the same time, there's no sanctions on the hospitals that are providing medical care for the terrorist groups, for example, in the Northwest, right? They're completely stocked with all the state-of-the-art equipment, MRIs, etc. And there are no sanctions on them receiving fuel and equipment through Turkey or from Turkey. Here, there is literally nothing. There is no fuel in the government pumps. Before, we used to receive a text message to tell us we can go and get our rationing of fuel. Those text messages now are coming about every 6 weeks. Before, they were coming every 4 or 5 days. Okay. There is no mazout diesel for heating, so people don't have heating. As I showed you, I'm sitting here with a hot water bottle. It's cold. Electricity in most areas is less than 1 or 2 hours per day. Okay. So household items are just simply not working. I mean, it's really, I've never seen Syria like this. Really, I haven't.
What's the end goal of this, Vanessa? We know the sanctions are aimed at depriving the people of basic necessities. What's the end goal of the Americans and the European Union? And what do you say to, and I would like to mention this particularly, there are so many so-called Syrian opposition figures, activists, journalists, etc., who say this is a lie and the United States isn't sanctioning the health sector or the humanitarian aid to Syria.
Of course they are. You know, sanctions are never anything but a collective punishment of a people or a nation that is refusing to capitulate to the agenda of the US and its allies. And that is exactly what is happening in Syria. You mentioned sanctions even pre-2011. And if we go back to 2004, of course, the Bush administration brought extraordinary sanctions against the Syrian government of Bashar al-Assad back then. Why? Because allegedly Syria was harboring terrorism. But let's look at who those terrorists were. Those terrorists were the PKK, right? The Kurdish separatists that now are being weaponized by the United States to effectively occupy the oil fields in the northeast and to trade Syrian oil, not only through Turkey, through Iraqi Kurdistan, but also then onwards into Israel. But also what it's doing, of course, is giving a knock-on revenue to Al-Qaeda, to Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, that also receives deliveries of stolen Syrian oil, and they process it. They have a monopoly on the processing of that oil and then the resale into Turkey. So this is an entire revenue loop which the US has created in order to fund its proxies, whether they are the Kurdish separatists, whether they are Al-Qaeda or Al-Sham or any one of the other factions that are working to continue occupying and annexing Syrian territory. Ambassador Jeffries, who was Mike Pompeo's kind of point man on Syria under the Trump administration, he made it very clear. I mean, he bragged about the effect of sanctions, right? I mean, this is the thing. Under the Trump administration, everything was very transparent. Right? There's like, Trump made it really clear, we're here to steal the oil. Jeffries made it really clear that Al-Qaeda is an asset to the US inside Syria. Of course, previously, Jake Sullivan had also done the same thing in an email to Hillary Clinton. And they've been very clear. It's not even really about taking the resources. The US doesn't need Syrian resources. But of course, what it's doing and what all of its proxy forces are doing is preventing the Syrian people from having access to their own resources.
Yes.
Syria was one of the biggest wheat exporters in the region. Now it's having to buy wheat, right? I mean, this is the crazy thing. Recent figures showed that Syria has lost something like $111 billion since the start of this war in oil revenue, crude oil and processed oil, etc. Right?
Do you mean by Jeffrey this Joel Ryburn?
No, Ambassador Jeffries.
I can't
remember
because recently this Joel Ryburn, I will just share his Twitter account probably on our conversation. He also, of course, blocked me after I called him a terrorist.
Yes, I saw that. Yeah.
So Joel Ryburn, he says he's the former special envoy of the United States to Syria, and now he's the director of the American Center for Levant Studies. I don't know what do they do in this research center because because I also saw that one of the women who works for him in this center, I really forgot her name right now, but I was on a live debate with her on TRT, Turkish channel a few years ago. And she lost her temper and she called me a Shabir.
I remember that.
And she called me live. Yeah, she even called when I said that my brother was kidnapped by the Islamists that she supports. She said because you're a thug for the government, so she even made an excuses for kidnapping civilians. And now she works as a research assistant or something in this. And I truly question sometimes. Because I live in Germany, and I have the impression that if you want to succeed in the public domain in Europe or in the United States, or if you want to become a genius that works for research centers to receive prizes, etc., the only thing you have to do is to be anti-Assad. The rest is just like the rest is just like it doesn't matter how much incompetent you are. Now, the end goal of the sanctions, that in my opinion, is to deprive the people from the basic necessities, to push them into desperation. And finally, for them, when hunger hits people, they will start eating each other, right? So it's lawlessness, it's disorder, it's corruption. Increase the spike of the corruption is partly because of the sanctions. It brings opportunity to private people to do business in Syria, because also the government needs these people to bring basic necessities, even if it means this person is corrupted. If a corrupt person will bring wheat to Syria to feed the people and get his a big share from it, then the government will do it, because the government isn't able to bring these basic necessities because it's sanctioned. And I want to mention this again. The sanctions aren't directly hitting the, I would say, the health sector or the agriculture sector. They make an exemption. However, this exemption is just cosmetic, because the fact is, if the country isn't able to pay money to any third country or a company which resides anywhere in the world to get the supplies, because you can't make transaction and you cannot pay cash. And even if you do so, like these companies are afraid to do business with Syria because of the sanctions.
So actually you pay more. That's the other thing. You pay a penalty, because for those companies, as they said, to take a risk, they will charge you more. Because their argument is, look, potentially we will be sanctioned. So if we take the risk, we expect you to pay much higher prices. And so the government now can't be, people don't realize that health and education to a large degree was free in Syria. But now the government doesn't have the resources to be able to maintain the public hospitals. Plus, you have, the 10 years of deliberate destruction of hospitals across the country. Remember the destruction of Al-Kindi, one of the biggest and most advanced cancer hospitals in the Middle East, was blown up when it was in, I can't remember,
2014.
And Jisr al-Shugur, again, one of the biggest hospitals, was seen of one of the worst massacres of the Syrian Arab army and civilians by the terrorist groups, aided, of course, by the white helmets who were clearing up the bodies afterwards. That's on video. So,
Vanessa, if I'm not mistaken, I think yesterday was the anniversary, the 7th anniversary or the 8th anniversary of the executing the guardians of the hospital. For those who don't know, the guardians or the soldiers regarding the hospital, they were all detained or captured by Al-Nusra Front, and they were executed on site. And there is still the brother of my friend, who is still missing since then, and they don't know if he's alive or dead. I think after 7 years, I'm sorry to say, but there is 99% chance that he's dead. They couldn't find his body. And this was one of the main hospitals, as you mentioned, in Aleppo. What really hurts me, not the Americans. You expect what the United States is going to do to Syria, right? Because the attitudes, the past decades, history. But for me, what really hurts me, that Iraq was an open book for people to learn some lessons. Libya was an open book for people to learn lessons. Afghanistan, so many places where the United States intervened, right? But still, there are Syrians who reside nowadays abroad, especially in the United States. They are still pushing now the Biden administration to impose more sanctions. And the claim is that the government of Bashar al-Assad is dealing with drugs, and they have made an empire of Dragistan, or, they say that the Assad government is financing its affairs or its capital through drug selling. So they're doing everything in their capacity to increase the sanctions, although they live in comfort outside. They did what they want to do to the country. They rise against the government. They failed. Now they want to take revenge. But they're not taking revenge from Assad. They're taking revenge from the people. And I really wonder sometimes, do they have a family? Don't they have a family in Syria? Someone they love in Syria? Like, personally, if I was dealing with the grocery guy who was living under my apartment, I have established a human relationship with this person. He was been working there for 10 years. We become friends, or we become close. I don't understand. Don't these people have anyone in Syria? And don't they ask them what these sanctions are doing? In my opinion, this is the true definition of treason, because you're not fighting against the government. If you're fighting against the government, I don't care. It's not, it's a political issue. But if you are deteriorating and worsening the conditions of the people there, 17, 18 people stuck in the country. It's like an open air prison now for them, because the basic human rights that they need to enjoy is they're deprived from due to these sanctions. And then you come and you deny that the sanctions are doing this to the people. Then I cannot say anything but you're a traitor to the country. If this is not treason, what else is treason?
Absolutely. And I think, when you ask what is the purpose of continuing these sanctions, I mean, we saw this very recently also in the alleged women's rights protests in Iran. When you have external Iranians that are funded usually by the State Department, either directly or indirectly, effectively calling for sanctions on their country. When I interviewed a young women's rights activist in Isfahan in Iran, the first thing she said to me is, how can we develop when we have sanctions? Sanctions are about regressing development in any target nation. They're about sending that country back to a completely dependent, dark age nation, third world country. I don't like using those kind of terms, but, an undeveloped country. Everything here, as you know, is destroyed. Much of it is destroyed. I don't want to give the impression that if I walk out the door, everything's a pile of rubble. It's specific areas of Damascus. But of course, as I said, what they deliberately targeted was essential civilian infrastructure. And that needs to be rebuilt in order for Syria to be self-sufficient. Again, the problem is also, in my view, you mentioned this feeling of siege and blockade. I was actually reading something this morning, and Syria now reminds me of Gaza on a much bigger scale. But if you look at all of Syria's borders are under the control of hostile forces, pretty much. And the border with Lebanon is kind of shut open. It's not reliable. And Lebanon itself has been pushed into an economic free fall following for a long time, but exacerbated by the Beirut port explosion and then by economic criminal mismanagement in Lebanon, right? I mean, inflation in Lebanon is actually even higher than Syria, but partly because Lebanon allows a dollar exchange. It allows a dollar economy to keep itself trading and going. Syria has made efforts to kind of prevent the devaluation of the Syrian pound. To some degree, it's been stable, but now it's starting to go down and down against the dollar, right? But what's the other reason for sanctions? It's the hope that they can persuade sectors of Syrian society to again rise up against the government. And to some degree, if we look at what happened in Sweden, we know that the protests that happened in Sweden last week were being engineered from outside and quite potentially by Israel, because Israel has always interfered in the affairs of the southern region, because they obviously want to take even more territory than the Golan territories to create a kind of buffer zone on Syria's borders to prevent any Iranian or Hezbollah influence in these areas, which are a threat, a direct threat to Israeli so-called security in the region, right? So we saw protests in Sweden and ridiculous demands from the so-called leaders of these protesters. I've visited Sweden many times, including in 2018, immediately after the US permitted ISIS attacks on the various villages and areas of Sweden city, which ended in the massacre of more than 200 people and the injury of many hundreds, more than 300, right? And I know that these are pockets and factions within the Sweden community that are being weaponized against the Syrian government. But the problem is, what the sanctions are doing are making it fertile ground for the West and its allies to again be able to influence the actions in those areas, right? And this is also another, that's why instead of relaxing the sanctions, they're increasing them.
Vanessa, I will mention something here, and I would like to make a link between the ISIS attack on Sweden. I think it was 2017, 16. I'm not 100% sure.
17.
I think it was 17, yeah. When the attack happened on Sweden, who from the neighboring countries said that they want to protect the Druze community in Syria? Exactly. It was Israel, right? So when I went to political science university, the first thing they taught us, when we are not, our job is not to foresee what's going to happen, is to analyze the event and the aftermath of the event. And the first thing we have to see who benefits from this event. When the attack happened, Israel came and said, I give my hand, I want to protect you, right? Because the government is overstretched and trying to keep the country secure from so many places. Now, when after the sanctions, the first movement that starts against the government is again from Sweden. And the political groups who are participating in the riots, because it's not a protest, like they burned down the government buildings, right? I mean, that's the definition of riots. Anyways, the people who did this are close to Walid Jumblat. And Walid Jumblat is a Druze politician in Lebanon, and he has an influence over these people in Sweden. And we all know Walid Jumblat is close to the United States, close to Saudi Arabia, and even close to Israel through his connections with the 14 March coalition in Lebanon. So whether it's ISIS or whether it's the sanctions that is making this turmoil in Sweden, the only benefactor is Israel from it. They want to divide this area and conquer it to the Golan Heights, which is also overwhelmingly inhabited by the Druze population, right? Israel has a project of creating another so-called buffer zone in Syria through this. And if the people do not see this, it's quite obvious what's happening there. You're hitting the country with harsh sanctions. You're creating the conditions for the people to rise against the government. And when it happens, you're exploiting it in your own favor. You're not even trying to help the people. Like, if you want to help the people in Sweden, send them bread, send them fuel, send them medication. Why you're saying, like, we want to help you to secure you? Because when you say secure, that means you are appointing yourself as the guarantor for the security, and that means conquer. You are planning to conquer. You're not trying to help these people.
Exactly, and you know, this has been the ongoing project of Israel, the Zionist entity, since the beginning of this war. If you look at characters like Moti Kahana, he's speaking openly on his Facebook account about the annexation of southern territories to add to their illegal annexation of the Golan territories. And we have to remember that Israel takes 30% of its overall water supply from the Golan, right? And Sweden itself is rich. It's fertile. It's incredibly abundant territory. And of course, when Trump was burning or enabling the burning of the wheat fields in the north and across Syria, actually, and the forests and so on, Israel was also setting fire through its proxies on the ground in the south. They were setting fire to the same agricultural areas down in the south. So this was a concerted effort. You also have to look at the fact that now there is a reemergence of ISIS in the area of Dara to the north of Sweden, for example. Where is ISIS coming from? It's coming from the American base in Al Tanef, where they are effectively training and recruiting and arming ISIS and then sending them on missions into the areas, into the Badia, into the desert east of Homs, but also into Dara. And there have been concerted efforts by the Syrian Arab Army to cleanse Dara of ISIS elements. So again, we're seeing the two hands of Israel and America, right, squeezing the people in Sweden and then offering them incentives to effectively, as you said, to start protests again, to stir up the dissent, because people are pissed off. You know, they're upset. Yes. They're without the basic necessities in life.
How close is Syria on the brink of the edge, in your opinion? Just last question for you, because you live there, and I really want your objective opinion about this, because I feel personally so many people on social media are completely frustrated from the government. They understand that the sanctions harm them, but at the same time, they see not much effort is being done from the government.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the government's own resources have been shrinking and shrinking and shrinking as resources have been occupied, etc., or destroyed, and so on. And the government, you know, any government doesn't have a bottomless pit that it can draw sources from in order to both restore and to keep a country going, let alone progressing and developing. It's impossible.
Yes.
And so, for me personally, the big problem is a lack of transparency. So there's a lack of communication between the problems, between the government and the people.
Yes.
And that would be the same probably in almost any country in the world under these conditions, because of on one hand, the government is probably afraid of saying, actually, we're really in trouble. But the thing is, if they don't do that, and if they keep offering to some degree false hope, then that increases the frustration among the people, right? When that hope doesn't come to fruition. And I think, actually, I would almost like to take a leaf from the book of Faris Shahabi in Aleppo, who is very open about the problems he faces, but he's also very open about the way to deal with them and the way to counter them and the way to address them. And, you know, it's not a criticism, because I totally understand how any government under siege is going to be struggling even to keep afloat, let alone to communicate and to tell the people what's going on, etc. But it's really needed right now, because these are people who for 11 years have resisted. Many of them have, the majority of them, have either relatives still in the Syrian army or relatives who died fighting for this country. And for me, I wish, you know, there are still so many resources in Syria that are being untapped. There is potential for Syria to become more self-sufficient and even in on a small community level, to begin to take care of its community, if you understand what I mean. They can allocate agricultural plots to various communities, even within Damascus, and then outside also in other cities, you know, so that people at least can grow their own food and so on. So there needs, this is my humble opinion, there needs to be communication between the districts and the government. There needs to be representatives from each talking on a regular basis to move forward and find solutions for the problems that are coming up, but not as they come up, before they come up. You know?
Yes.
This is
Vanessa, what you mentioned is very important. I think the lack of communication is very serious between the Syrian government and the people. And when I watch sometimes a minister goes live on TV trying to explain the situation, and to be honest, I feel like he's not respecting my intelligence. He's not respecting that I am able to dig in and understand that this is not the case, or this is not the entire truth. So they're not really presenting the entire image to the people. It's true that the sanctions are harming the people, but at the same time, the lack of transparency with the people is affecting the mood, the entire environment in the country. For example, I make a video on the unilateral sanctions. I host Alena Duhan, and I translate, for example, 10 minutes from this video, and I post it on Facebook, and more people will believe and get convinced by this 10 minutes video that how much these sanctions are harming the people, because compared to any minister who goes on a TV and tries to explain the situation. Because the people, when they see someone, we call in Syria from the ages of the dinosaurs, because he doesn't have any etiquette in speaking, he doesn't know how to deliver his message, they don't present any graphics, they don't present any hard evidence for this, it's just talk. And then they go and click on Al Jazeera or Al Arabiya, and they see these countries, TV channels presenting in a very high quality reportages with statistics, with graphics from their own perspective, saying that the sanctions aren't harming. It's Bashar al-Assad stealing you. He has all the oil. He has all the infrastructure intact. They get influenced by that because for the eyes and for the ears, it's more impactful. So it really hurts me to see incompetent people in positions of power in Syria. And I'm saying this as a Syrian, and I'm allowed to criticize the Syrian government. I know there are so many people incompetent in positions of power. I know there is a high level of corruption in Syria. I know lots of people are fighting each other in the inner circle just to have more status, more power, more etc. So this is, of course, worsening the situation in the country for the people. This has to change. We have to find creative solutions. I understand that we lack lots of resources in Syria, but I can see people presenting solutions. I can see people with higher degrees, a PhD in agriculture, presenting solutions for the potato, for the wheat, for the different types of agricultures in Latakia or in other areas where it's possible to do that. And these people have been fought by certain figures in the country because they are benefiting from the corruption. So the sanctions are increasing the corruption levels in the country. If the people think it's otherwise, they are misled. And this is just my opinion. And I really wish that one day, I know I've been saying this for 11 years now, the people in the United States or in Europe would care as much about Syria as they claim to be caring about Ukraine and the Ukrainians. And it really irritates me to see all these people talking about Ukraine when they utter nothing. It's just like we don't exist, for them in the other parts of the world. And I truly believe this is partly because of racism, and these people think they have some sort of moral higher ground, or some people are more important than others.
Well, to give you an idea, when I put out the Twitter thread on the effects of sanctions, especially now, what shocked me more than anything else, and this was I think this was before Elena Dohan's report, or maybe just after, was the number of people 11 years into this war who were saying to me, "Oh, is the US sanctioning Syria? Is Syria under sanctions?" What? Seriously? I mean, everyone knows about Ukraine, right? Everyone knows about Ukraine. Why? Because the media is telling you about Ukraine, and the media is selling you the idea that Ukrainians are like us. As you say, it's inherent racism. Because how many people have kept talking about what's happening to 23 million Yemenis under the auspices of the UN resolution 2216? No one. Even in Iran, sanctions are still ongoing in Iran, and have been for decades, and they've killed probably more women than the veiling laws in Iran, right? I mean, when the West talks about human rights, and it's effectively punishing half the world for just existing, for trying to keep their own resources safe from US pillage and plundering, and they're being punished for this. And yet the populations of the US and the UK and the EU are largely oblivious to it, And when people tell me, this is when I get mad, is when people tell me they don't have agency. Everyone has agency. You just need to believe that you have agency and actually do something. Please, Syria is literally hemorrhaging right now. It really is. I can't describe how important it is right now to bring the focus back on Syria and to start really pushing, start really leveraging your governments, anyone that will listen, media, or NGOs, human rights organizations, get on their back. You do have agency. Everyone has agency. I don't accept this as an excuse not to do something. Sorry, that's
Vanessa, I don't like to be pessimistic, but after 12 years of war against Syria, started by military means and now through sanctions, I genuinely think there is a zombie culture in bigger part of this Western world, and they are driven by sentiments injected by the media. They become crazy when the media tells them they have to be mad on the non-vaccinated. They will be mad on the non-vaccinated. When they say they have to be mad at Russia because of Ukraine, excluding all the history of the conflict, like as if it started in 2022, right? And they tell them to be mad at Iran because of the veiling laws. They tell them to be mad at Assad because he gassed his own people, allegedly, right? So in my opinion, bigger part is hypnotized, and this is what an old wise man the other day told me. He said, you guys in the Middle East, your governments practice authority or control the people through a Jacobian force. That means they use the security, they use the police, and they are able to control the people. In the West, he says, maybe there is a lesser use for the police and the intelligence apparatuses. However, there is a big control by the deep state over the media, over the education, over the history books, over the books that is being sold in the libraries. Everything. The other day, I went to a library. I was traveling and I wanted to buy a book to read. And like, you just see the first 10 books is like how Putin is evil, how Putin is all in his face is blood. And then you have Bill Gates is warning us about global environmental climate change. Like, seriously, this is how they control. They practice hegemony over the people, intellectual hegemony. And the people think they're free. They think that they know the truth. Sorry, I think they're living in a big bubble. They're living in a big fake bubble, and they don't know at all what's going on around the world. But some of them, especially those who work in the public field, they benefit from it. They're getting good jobs, they're getting good positions. So it's also a matter of interest. Anyways, I bragged a lot today about so many things. I was a little bit angry because sometimes I feel like I'm living like at least my wife is awake and she's not woke, and I can talk. I talk with her about these topics at night, and I never indoctrinate, for example, my wife. I just played an interview for Bashar al-Assad, 2 interviews, actually 25 minutes. I didn't tell her at all what to think of. And she just asked me, so this is the guy who am I supposed to believe that he is a brutal dictator, or he is Hitler of the 21st century? Because this is what the German media tells them, right? Anyways, it was really, really nice, Vanessa, to chat with you on this topic. You live in Damascus. You feel with the Syrians. You are in touch with them. You can interact with them. You can see what's happening to them, and you're sharing this experience with me and the audience of Syriana Analysis. I really appreciate, and God bless you and give you strength in this cold winter. And I hope the tankers that arrived in Damascus, in Jableh a few days ago, they would be like turned into fuel mazot very soon.
Everyone is
Meine Güte. Anyways, thank you so much, Vanessa, for your time.
And congratulations on the marriage. I have to say that publicly.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Every time somebody I feel like I'm gonna tear up because it's a really good thing to have a nice family, to build a family. This is just
congratulations, and I hope to meet you both.
Thank you,
soon
dear.
In Aleppo.
We will, inshallah. Inshallah.
Okay.
Inshallah.
Thanks.
See you, Vanessa.
Take care.
Bye.